So when the original Proton X70 was launched in 2018, a lot of people were saying that that car has a lot of Volvo technology. So it's practically like buying a Volvo XC60 for cheap. But that is obviously not true because the engine is all Geely and not Volvo. But now for the 2020 locally assembled CKD version, this car now has a proper true blue Volvo gearbox, a 7-speed dual clutch transmission. So let's see what's new on the CKD model, what's been improved, what's been left the same, and how does the DCT feel like to drive? And what about the handling? Is it even better than before, or is it about the same? Let's go. Okay, right off the bat, the X70 CKD 2020 model comes about with 6 improvements. So I'm going to go into each one of them. But let's start with something that I find to be a little bit disappointing. It's a bit underwhelming. And that is the styling changes. Pretty much the only thing they've changed is the badge, which is on the front grille, all the wheels, and this steering boss over here. After being told for a year and a half that, wait for the CKD, you'll find something surprising there, we now see this and I'm like, is that it? But then again, Proton is saying that it's only been a year since the car has been around in Malaysia, so it's still fresh in everybody's eyes, so I can't really argue with that. That is quite true. They've also said that over the next few years they will update the car visually as well as internally. They've also latched on the year to each car's model name right now. This is the 2020 X70. Maybe they'll do a year-on-year update. Next year it'll be 2021 X70. That could be something to look forward to as well. So you're always buying the latest and greatest that Proton can offer. Anyway, let's talk about the badge itself. On the front grille, I think the badge is somewhat too large. It doesn't fit the grille as nicely as the previous logo, I think. But I've been assured by Proton staff that you get used to it the more you look at it. We'll see if that actually happens. And then inside, this again is a little bit distracting because this is finished in chrome, and if you look at the entire cabin, this is the only thing that is finished in chrome. Everything else has a more subtle satin silver finish. I think if this was done in satin silver, it would have looked much better, but yeah, what can I do? Anyway, let's move on from there and talk about the rest of the car. The biggest difference, the most significant change is the transmission. It now has a 7-speed wet dual clutch transmission from Volvo and Geely in place of the old 6-speed automatic that was made by an Australian transmission maker, DSI. This is the exact same gearbox that's being used in a lot of Volvo cars, and in fact all Volvo DCTs are made in the exact same plant in Ningbo, China. So this new gearbox, it weighs a little bit lighter than the old gearbox. The old one is about 100 kilograms, this is about 75 kilograms, so there's around about 25% saving in terms of weight right there. But beyond just a weight saving measure, this is also a much more advanced gearbox. As you know, a normal automatic torque converter transmission does have a fair bit of transmission losses. In fact, we've done a dyno test on my own X70, and from there you can see that the transmission loss is around 10%, which as far as the modern automatic transmissions go is not too bad, it's not too shabby. But this DCT is claimed to be as efficient as 97%, only 3% losses in terms of transmission. You'll definitely feel the difference in terms of that because you get more of what the engine offers to be transferred onto the road. As for the engine outputs, it is the same horsepower as before, 181 horsepower, but torque has been up by 15, up from 285 to now 300 Newton meters of torque. Now, this difference in torque is not so much to do with Geely wanting to give it more power. It's just because the old transmission was limited to around 285 Newton meters, which is why they tuned down the engine to that level. Now, this new gearbox is limited to 330 Newton meters, so now they are able to push the engine back up to its natural state, which is 300 Newton meters of torque. Now, in terms of actual performance, you do feel that this is a more powerful car. You do feel that it's much faster than the old car. Proton claims that the 0 to 100 times have been dropped from 10.5 seconds to 9.5 seconds, a full second quicker than before. To drive, it doesn't feel like a sub 10-second car per se, because it's still a rather slow surge from 0 onwards. But beyond 60 kilometers and above, this is a powerful car. Now on to how the DCT feels by itself. It's a bit different to what you're used to in other brands' DCTs. In a normal DCT, it's usually like this. Going from a slow standstill, it's a bit rough, and then as it goes up the speeds, it feels really quick. It feels lightning quick. You don't feel the gear changes. It's almost imperceptible as it goes up. The gear changes 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 and so on. With this car, it's almost the polar complete opposite. It starts off with a very gentle creep, and that's a good thing for a DCT because usually DCTs are rough at slow speeds. This is ultra smooth. It pretty much acts like a normal automatic transmission. That's definitely a good thing. But as the speeds rise, you do feel the gear changes. There are small little lapses and pauses in terms of power delivery where you can see and feel the gear changes. That's something you don't normally see in DCTs, but you do feel it in this one. I suppose it's something to do with reliability. I suppose they really want this gearbox to last, so they don't put it in such an aggressive state. Proton also claims that they've changed the mapping, the shift maps, to fit Malaysian usage slightly better. Apparently in China, people drive in a much more relaxed state, whereas Malaysians tend to be a bit more aggressive with their throttle. That obviously is kind of true. In any case, this does not feel like a performance gearbox. A lot of people think DCTs are meant to be on fast cars, high performance cars like a Golf GTI and an A45 and things like that. But this is here to be more efficient. It's not so much in terms of performance, but you also get slightly better fuel consumption, of course. In the case of the X70, it's claimed to go down by 13%, down to 7.6 litres per 100 kilometers. That's around 13 kilometers per litre on a rough count. Well, the old car, the one I had, I've done about 16,000 kilometers on it, and I average about 10 kilometers per litre. So say I get about 10% better, 11 kilometers per litre, that would still be a big improvement. Won't be quite as good as a comparable Honda CR-V, of course, but then again, 11 kilometers per litre on a car this big and this heavy, that's not so bad. Still on the gearbox, like I said before, this is the exact same one used by Volvo. So Volvo has very, very high requirements in terms of reliability, and this gearbox has been rated to last at least 350,000 kilometers. The average industry standard by other brands is about 240,000. This is 350,000 kilometers. Volvo has a rather decent reputation when it comes to mechanical reliability, so that bodes well for this car, for Proton and Geely as well, I suppose. Speaking of reliability concerns for the dual clutch transmission, remember this is a wet type DCT, not a dry type DCT. So wet types are known to be more reliable than dry types, and Volvo and Geely have gone through a lot of hard work in making sure that this gearbox is reliable. They've done testings all over the world, racking up millions and millions of testing kilometers. They've even done testing here in Malaysia, doing the usual stress tests, going up and down Genting. They've done over 100,000 kilometers in Malaysia in our heat on our roads. So Proton says there's no particular reliability concern regarding its DCT. And in terms of maintenance, we've been told that it will be around the same as the normal automatic gearbox, so don't expect to have to pay more to maintain this car. In fact, I've gone through the service manual, and the service intervals for the automatic fluid change is set at 80,000 kilometers or every 4 years, whereas in the automatic car that is set at every 60,000 kilometers or 3 years. So it's not going to be a lot cheaper to maintain, but at least it's a little bit, tiny bit cheaper, plus you get fuel savings along the way. Another thing that's changed together with the gearbox is this gear lever over here. You no longer get a physical normal gear lever as before. This is now an electronic shift-by-wire gear lever. So it's something that's similar to what you'd find in a modern BMW. This funny little joystick over here moves back and forth, but it goes back to its original place as soon as you're done with it. Well, while I do think this new gear knob looks decent, it looks modern, it looks cool, but overall this whole piece around it looks a little bit plain. There's nothing there, there's nothing here, it's just plain black. I do hope that they could have done something to make it look a little bit more exciting, but yeah, I guess they couldn't be bothered. In any case, there's this big P button over here, which also means you can't rest your palms on the gear knob because you might touch this small little P button. But I've tried it, I've pressed the button and it just says, yeah, it's smart enough to think that you might press the P button by accident and it will not engage P. So yeah, it's quite clever. Before we move on to other changes, the engine itself is exactly the same as before. We've asked this many times over and they said mechanically it's identical to the CBU models. It's just that the torque has been changed slightly. That is to do with the gearbox, not much to do with the engine. What they have changed, however, is the engine cover. So it looks a little bit weird because it looks like it's hiding a longitudinally mounted engine instead of a transverse engine, but that's only for car nerds, I suppose. Myself, and I'm sure a lot of people, were also surprised that Proton is keeping to the same 1.8 litre turbocharged engine instead of the newer 1.5 litre turbocharged engine. Now that one is shared together with Volvo, so I would assume it's more advanced still. But Proton has talked to a lot of its own customers and the conclusion is Malaysians are still somewhat conservative when it comes to engine options. They would still prefer a larger capacity engine when it comes to SUVs, which are big and heavy, right? Regardless of the actual power outputs, power, torque, whatever it is. Beyond that, I haven't tested the new 1.5 litre just yet myself, but that is a 3-cylinder engine, so I'm not quite sure how well insulated, how well the refinement of that engine will be. And refinement, like I said, is one of this car's biggest strengths. It is fantastic at a cruise. You barely hear the engine, you don't listen, you don't feel much vibrations at all. And in fact, this is the quietest car in the class under acceleration, under cruise. This is quieter, is a lot quieter than the CR-V. It's a little bit quieter even than the Mazda CX-5. So it would be a big pity if you fit this car with a new engine and you lose a little bit of that advantage, right? The newer 1.5 litre engine has the potential of having more power and also better fuel economy than this car, but it also runs the risk of losing the refined edge of this car. So to talk about it that way, I think Proton has made the correct decision with this one. Moving on to the next update, there are now ventilated front seats for the executive and premium models. In Malaysia, that is an absolute godsend. Just look outside, it's so warm out there, so to have your bottoms cooled from the seat itself is very, very nice. The problem is there's no physical button to turn this on. You have to go through the screen over here, press HVAC button and then small tiny button to turn on the seat cooling, the seat ventilation function. I think there's an empty button over there. They could have just used that button, but yeah. Oh, you can also use high proton to turn on the seat function, but yeah, I think in 1 year of owning the car, I've used it maybe 5 times in a year. Yeah, and I don't think a lot of X70 owners will actually use that function all that often anyway. It's more of a novel gimmick. I mean, it's great to impress your friends the first time they sit in the car. Beyond that, there's not much use for it. Change number 3, still talking about the seats, is the rear seat bench. The seat backrest now can be angled back even more, can be reclined more, so it's more comfortable over long distances. The old car was already very, very comfortable at a cruise. Now it's even better still for the rear occupants. Like I can see from there my passengers are already asleep, so I guess it really is that comfortable. With that change came along a revised rear tonneau cover. There's now a slight railing for it, so it looks a little bit better, it's more stable as well, but that's a very minor change. I don't even consider that to be part of the 6 changes for this car. Going beyond that, there is now an addition of a power boot function finally on premium cars. A lot of existing owners have been putting on retrofitting the power boot function for around 1,000, 1,500 out there. It's quite cheap. It's got a simple one, but the problem is they may affect their car's warranty, so that's not a good thing. So it's absolutely great that Proton is fitting that as standard on premium cars. Next, we're going to talk about the variants available. The old car is available in 4 variants: the standard, executive, executive all-wheel drive, and the premium. This one, there is still 4 variants, but the all-wheel drive variant has been dropped. Proton says that in the CBU car, less than 5% of customers bought the all-wheel drive version, so it doesn't make any sense for them to keep making more. So they've just completely dropped it. They now only have normal standard, executive, premium, and premium X. All are front-wheel drive, 2-wheel drive versions. The premium X is new, but it's practically the same as the old premium together with the sunroof. The premium is the same as the premium X, just without the sunroof, so they've practically made the sunroof an optional item. I've mentioned this before many times over. We live in Malaysia, we don't need a sunroof because it's hot and you have to tint it, double tint it just to make it less hot, and you'll never ever use it unless again you want to impress your friends or you're going up Genting or something. But how often do you do that, right? So I think this is a good thing that they are offering sunroof as an option. Me myself, if I had that option when buying the car, I would not pay for the sunroof. If I can save 3,000, 4,000 to not have a sunroof, I'd gladly do that. Speaking of price, the CKD cars will be slightly cheaper, and together with the bump in specs, the ventilated seats, the power boot, the value overall is a lot better. And of course, let's not forget the new complicated, much more advanced gearbox. That of course is a lot more expensive to make as well. So yeah, you do get a lot more for what you're paying for. Now let's move on to the ride and handling of this car. Unfortunately, they haven't changed a whole lot, so this car feels very much like the original Geely Boyer to drive. The steering is completely unchanged. The suspension has only been slightly fine-tuned to fit Malaysian driving characteristics slightly better. So this car does not get the full Proton ride and handling treatment, so it doesn't feel like, say, a Privé or an iRace to drive. It's not enjoyable to drive per se, but the fine tuning is slightly better. You do get a tiny bit less body roll compared to the CBU. I think if you drive this car by itself, you're likely not to find much differences or much improvements. But if you take the cars back to back, you will see some changes in terms of the body control. The handling characteristics of the X70 was perhaps its biggest weakness, because everything else in the car is great, it's fantastic. Handling is somewhat average. So this has been slightly improved a tiny bit to fit Malaysian drivers a bit more, but overall this is still not not a fantastic, not a super enjoyable car. It's not a Mazda CX-5 for sure, but the payback for that is great ride comfort, and in this sense this has the best ride comfort in the class. I think it is much better than the CX-5, which is too stiff. I think it's also better than the CR-V, which I think is a bit too soft and too roly-poly. This strikes the perfect middle ground, and it's really supremely comfortable both on the highways and even in the cities with or even back roads with a lot of potholes and road bumps and whatnot. This car stays stable, this car stays very planted across the highways, and I think this is a pleasure to drive in that sense. So overall, I mean, this is not a night and day difference between the CBU to the CKD. In terms of build quality, I don't see a big difference, any noticeable difference. Most of the parts feel about the same, and in fact most of the parts are still supplied by the same suppliers in China, whether they are back there or even they've set up a joint venture in Tanjung Malim. Either way, the cars feel pretty much identical. The seat leather, the Napa leather, I think it looks a little bit darker now. It's more cocoa rather than saddle brown than before, but it still feels the same as before. It's still a very nice and soft, supple Napa leather quality. For now, I don't see any physical clue that this is now made in Malaysia rather than made in China. For those of you who are always skeptical about locally assembled cars, well, I don't see any difference actually. One last thing to note, this car also has a new color option called Space Grey. To me, it's the best looking X70 around now. It's a grey with a slight tinge of blue or purple depending on how you look at it. I think it looks great. It looks a lot better than my old favorite color, this jet grey. The other 5 color options are still available, but you now get option of 2 different greys, jet grey here or space grey. If I were to buy a new car now, that's the one I would take. So overall, like I said, there's not a night and day difference. It's still very much the same X70 experience. The gearbox is slightly better, it feels slightly faster, fuel consumption is slightly better, and then there's of course the new logos inside and outside. The rest of the car is as it was before. Ride and handling, still not great, but ride comfort is fantastic. The interior over here, build quality is good. There's a lot of soft touch materials around. There's supple Napa leather, best in the business. And down here, this head unit is it's a little bit distracting because it's a little bit too reflective, I would say, but it's still better than what you get in a Honda CR-V, for instance. There's still no Apple CarPlay, there's still no Android Auto. You still have to rely on the onboard Baidu Maps, which it has been improved a lot since the last time I used it. The maps are a lot better, but the thing is, the interface doesn't look that great. The map itself, it does not feel like a properly Malaysian local product. There's a lot of Chinese characters on it. I think that doesn't quite fit right with a car that is supposed to be Malaysianized, supposed to be localized, I think. Overall, I think this is still a car in a class of its own. There's nothing that you can compare it with. You can compare it against a Honda HR-V for the same price. You do get a lot more with this car compared to that one. You can physically compare this against its class rivals such as the CR-V and the Mazda CX-5s. And yes, even if this car is priced directly against those, I would still consider this over those cars, let alone with a 50,000 ringgit discount. Hell yes, I get a Proton X70. This is still a great car inside and outside, especially if you do a lot of mileage on highways. This is the car to get no matter what the pricing is. Below 120,000 ringgit for the car without the sunroof, that's the one you should buy. No brainer, complete no brainer. So there you go, the 2020 Proton X70 CKD. While yes, visually it's a bit underwhelming because the only thing they've changed is the badges, but the changes underneath are a lot more impressive. The 7-speed wet dual clutch gearbox feels very good, very solid, and it brings improvements in terms of performance and fuel economy, so that's win-win. Besides, you can now genuinely say you get a slice of Volvo with your Proton. Now that sounds cool, right? And besides that, the other improvements such as the reclinable rear seats, the ventilated front seats, the power boot, the slightly enhanced handling, and the move to make the sunroof optional, it does make it clear that Proton is really listening to all of its customers, making constant incremental improvements along the way. As for the CKD build quality, well, like I said, there's no discernible difference between this and the CBU. So for those worried about build quality issues, you don't have to. And besides, since when is made in China sound better than made in Malaysia? So overall, the 2020 X70 is a small step forward instead of a big leap compared to the CBU. But remember, the original X70 is such a great car from the very beginning, and this improves on that even more. At this price range, I think nothing else comes close, and Proton is in a class of its own. I would wholeheartedly recommend this for everybody looking for a family SUV. So what do you think of all this? Let us know in the comment section below, and thank you for watching.